And folks, we'll get more chairs. Who needs seats? Please raise your hands if anyone needs seats.
Those people are standing.
I think because there's seats over back there. You've got seats, great. Okay, wonderful.
Okay. Right, let me welcome everybody to our maiden voyage here. After 81. After 81 years, we heard a former Secretary of Agriculture was going to be in town, and we thought we'd take a shot and try to put on an event here. And we're just so grateful to have you folks here today. It really means a lot. There was this time not so distant past when there was a real question whether there would be a bookstore here. So I can't begin to tell you how grateful we are that you are here. There is a bookstore. The community has rallied. And it seems particularly great that a friend and a neighbor and a great communitarian and a maven about the environment will be our interlocutor, Daniel Weiss. And I'm especially happy to have the former Secretary of Agriculture, and a 9-term congressman, a professor at the Harvard Institute of Politics, the head of the Motion Picture Association. And from what his book teaches us, quite a mensch growing up in Wichita. I've read the book. I wish we would be able to show it to you tonight, but the publishing industry is not always what we had hoped. There it is. There's one to show. Thank you. Thank you very much. There are many on the way. I like the book. There are one great reason, which I'll talk about in a second, which is the through line of an interesting, important, consequential life lived in a decent, indeed admirable way. But there are two other lesser reasons, I think, to buy this book. So his dad, Milton, was a bit of a comedian. If you are bereft of dad jokes, this is a book. There's a book for you. So just a couple that stuck with me, and I think I should share. Says his father, "You know, I proposed to my wife in a garage, and then I couldn't back out." Okay. The other night, I swallowed a muffler. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. This gives you a feel. This gives you a feel for what it was like to grow up in a Jewish family in Wichita, Kansas, in this time. The other secondary reason to buy the book are the photographs, and it will remind many of us how lucky we are to not dress as we did in the 1970s. There is a picture of the congressman with President Jimmy Carter in a plaid jacket that really is indescribable, but must be witnessed. It's worth the price of the book itself. So I commend that to you as well. But the book is really the narrative, as I said, of a great and interesting life, starting in Wichita, Kansas, Jewish family, one of 300 or so. 2 temples, one, of course, that you belong to and one you would never belong to. The University of Michigan, George Washington University Law School, work for a Republican on the Hill. So there's a bit of a conversion that occurs in the Secretary's life. Back to Wichita, run in the school board, be elected to the Congress 9 times. And then face the Newt Gingrich 1994 election and be sort of out of work for a short time. until a friend from the White House decides that this would be an opportunity to take somebody from Kansas to be the Secretary of Agriculture. 6 years of an interesting time there, showing what it means to be able to act moderately in everything that one does. And then life that goes on in the other ways that I've described, the Harvard Institute, the MPAA, and raising 2 kids, a wife of many decades. And I conclude only by reminding all of us here of the reason why the Secretary's life has been so impactful. He quotes twice sort of a life goal that Daniel Webster has written in the House of Representatives: do something worthy to be remembered. And certainly our guest tonight has done that. So thank you for being here.
We didn't even plan that, but when you have the owner of a bookstore that's a brilliant lawyer, he makes introductions that covers all the ground. So we're done now. You know everything you need to know about Secretary Glickman's life in the book, in that brilliant précis by Bert Deichsler. My name's Daniel Weiss, and before we get started, I did want to just thank our host, Bert, for a minute. And he's too modest to get into it, but for those of us in this room, and I know there are a number, that read to our children and taught them to read, in some cases, in Chevalier's bookstore, we were terrified at the loss of this oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. And Bert, with his sense of civic duty, I assure you, his law practice P&L is superior to that of this bookstore, came in and really saved Chevalier's as a treasure for our community. And without you doing that, you and Leslie, Bert, we wouldn't be here today. So all our gratitude and appreciation to you. So I'm looking around at this warm crowd, and I got to say, one of the first things that comes to mind is, why am I doing this interview? We've got these luminaries of journalism, of communications, of American politics seated in this audience, and you're stuck with a venture capitalist who's asking you some questions. But anyway, we'll do our best to make our way through it. Many of you know that our distinguished author and guest tonight is referred to by some as Congressman, by others as Secretary Glickman, but since Dan is a good government public servant, I feel like I should give full disclosure about my biases up front. He is known to me as neither of those things. He's known to me, and has been for the better part of 15 years, as Papa Danny. Papa Danny came into the Weiss family's lives. His grandchildren and our children have been at school together in some way, shape, or form for almost a decade and a half. And his son, John, is one of my very close friends. And I frankly consider Dan and Rhoda to be really the closest thing I have to a surrogate family in Washington, D.C. And so when Dan asked me to do this, I really had no choice in the matter. So let's jump in, Papa Danny, with...
I might change the will, actually.
So let's start with some softballs. I can't guarantee you they're all going to be softballs, but we'll start with some softballs. So let's go chronologically and talk a little bit. You start the book, Dan, talking about your childhood growing up in Wichita, Kansas, and how your experience in Wichita, your family experience, your community experience really shaped your worldview and who you became. Could you talk a little bit about some of the highlights of that and maybe a couple of anecdotes along the way?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Daniel. I call you Papa Daniel, but I'm 30 years older than you are, but thank you, Bert, very much. And of course, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, and my wife are here. And we're going to celebrate our 55th anniversary in August, so it's a long time. But you know, it's like my grandparents came here from the old country, and my grandfather used to say that he was one of the first settlers in Kansas. He settled for 10 cents on the dollar. That was his story. And that sense of humor made it through the genes of him and my parents and pretty much on to me for the whole time. So, you know, in some sense, my story is like a lot of yours here, you know, wherever you came from. But they came and my grandfather was a peddler and then went into the scrap iron business. And then during the oil boom, during the late 30s and early 40s, they bought pipe and oil field supplies. And they were, then it turned into the oil business, and he and my father went into business. And you know, they had a successful business, and my dad loved baseball, so we owned a AAA baseball team, the Wichita Arrows. We were affiliated with the Chicago Cubs during the time that if a person hit a foul ball, they called him up to Chicago. That's how bad they were and we were. And so, it was, I'd say, what I call a good, solid, upper middle class existence. And my parents had this great sense of humor. My dad had this kind of Henny Youngman, Rodney Dangerfield. He had this one joke, you know, your mother and I have sex almost every night. Really? Yeah. Almost on Monday, almost on Tuesday, almost on Wednesday, you know, and these stories, Rhoda's heard 1,000 times, and, you know, and so, but my mother had a much more kind of natural, genuine wit, but also, you know, they had both periods of compatibility and incompatibility. And I had an older brother and a younger sister, and as the middle child, I was the classical middle child. I was the conflict avoider, and I think it's one of the reasons I went into politics, because I wanted everybody to get along, let's work this out, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work. But the fact that we were Jewish was, you know, I knew I was not part of the majority population, but it really wasn't a major factor in my life. We belonged to the Orthodox synagogue, and as Bert says, there were 2 synagogues in Wichita. Whichever one you went to, the other one was a disgrace. So we went to the more religious, and I had a full Jewish education, a full bar mitzvah, and chanted the entire service in Wichita. They had like 4 bar mitzvahs a year, and this was at an Orthodox synagogue. So, you know, it's kind of what was expected of you. But I'd say it was a fairly normal existence, but I was always interested in politics for whatever reason. So I was president at the 6th grade at Fabrique Elementary School, election commissioner at Southeast High School. I was not an athlete at all. That wasn't part of the deal, although I was on the golf team, and on the debate team. You know, I just think it evolved into me always being interested in politics. My parents were the classic moderate of moderates. They were registered Republicans, but in Kansas, we're the longest running state in the country that has not elected a Democratic senator. 1930 was the last Democratic senator, 32. And but they were moderates and centrists, and it kind of just followed from there. But my folks were popular in the community, and my dad had a long white hair and a ponytail. He used to drive around in his red Jaguar convertible, and you know, and it made people laugh. And that was kind of part of the deal. So anyway, that's kind of gives
Milton had a ponytail?
He had a ponytail later in life, but you know, the other hand, he was a little bit. He had this amiable quality. He also had a Don Corleone quality. So you had to be loyal. Loyalty was demanded. And if you weren't loyal, it was clearly not rewarded. So, you know, we lived in that kind of environment. A lot of laughter, a lot of fun, but a little bit like Michael in The Godfather.
While you bring that up, and since at least one of your progeny is sitting in the audience,
Yeah.
let me ask you a question, actually. Go off script for a minute and ask you a question about parenting.
Yeah.
Are you, you know, between your two parents, anyway, are you more Milton or more Gladys?
Much more Gladys, I would say.
Can
Wouldn't
you explain that to the
I don't know.
crew here?
Yeah.
What does that
well,
mean
well,
as
okay.
a parent?
So Milton had had sense of humor, telling stories, telling jokes, and he also had this great philosophy of life. He says, everybody you meet, remember, is insecure. Even the people who act like they're in charge in the world and they're the happiest and they're the most successful, down deep, they're got a lot of insecurities. So if you can make them feel good and if you can make them feel happy, you have a friend for life. And that's the way his philosophy of business was. And so he was very good. He would talk to anyone. He was not a snob in the least. He used to tell me, he said, you never know that person on the street where he's going to be or she's going to be tomorrow. You'll be up, they'll be down, they'll be down, you'll be up. But he was tended to be non-forgiving, especially when you didn't do the kinds of things that he wanted you to do. So even simple things, like call him before 6 o'clock in the morning on his birthday. I mean, you know, it was kind of like that. My mother was the opposite. She was very forgiving and also funny, but I tended to gravitate to her when I had any issues or any kind of problem. They were a good couple, but for the first 20 or 30 years of their marriage, it was not what I call heaven on earth every day. It was an existence where we weren't quite sure what was going to happen that day. A little bit like the Trump era in our family.
Let's stay just on some of the personal for a second before we get into policy and your career in Congress and at USDA. You talked in the acknowledgments of your book about mentors, the importance of mentors. Now, you know, you list a number of them that many people sitting here, names would recognize, you know, Clinton, Jack Valenti, Walter Isaacson, Gore Dole, people that played important professional help roles and in your career. But who would you, outside of public life, who was the most important mentor
Well,
to you?
certainly, I mean, in family. I mean, every member of my family, Rhoda, John, Amy, and Rhoda's family, because she had a larger family, were that way. But I had a debate teacher in high school. Her name was Myrn Rowe, and she was hell on wheels. And she that later became my campaign manager. And she was the one who basically helped guide my political career. And she was, like I say, tough as nails, and it shows you the power of a teacher, and she had that power.
Interesting. All right, let's jump into, so Myrn was your chief of staff in Congress. Let's jump into your congressional career for a second. So you talk a lot in the book about the importance, maybe it's your middle child, I think there might be some psychologists in the room here, they could unpack that later, but whatever those factors that contribute.
And
to
Corey
that.
knows Wichita.
Yeah.
She grew up down the street from me, so she knows what the psychology was like in Wichita.
But you talk a lot about the importance of bipartisanship, about reaching across the aisle. You almost, write wistfully about another period of time in American political life where that actually seemed feasible. Could you talk a little bit about, in your career, sort of highlights of those bipartisan moments, and what were kind of either the causal factors or circumstances that made a couple of them possible?
Well, first place, my dad was in the scrap iron business, and so when I went into Congress, I went on the Agriculture Committee, and I thought it was the biggest mistake of my life, and I wanted to be on the Ways and Means Committee or the Appropriations Committee or the Commerce Committee, and my chief of staff said, no, you're going on the agriculture committee. And, or at least she kind of pushed me in that direction. She said, you'll be the most urban member of the agriculture committee, which I was, believe it or not, from Wichita, Kansas. Everybody else represented a town of 11 people. And so at least I had 275,000 people. And she said that it will build your career. You can lead in that direction. And it's also, agriculture policy is very bipartisan. The only thing that's required is you spend more money than anybody else on farmers. If you do that, it doesn't matter if you're Democrats or Republicans. You know, I mean, it's like, and so that entire career allowed me to do things not only in traditional agriculture, but we had jurisdiction over all the federal feeding programs. So I was involved in SNAP, helped expand it, food stamps, school lunch, school meals, WIC. There's a WIC here, but the different WIC. And women, infants, children, and so I became very interested in domestic and global hunger and tried to lead on those issues. That was all out of the Agriculture Committee. And then they also had jurisdiction over the commodities markets, and that interested me. And today I'm the lead director of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I've been on that board for 20 years. So where did that come from? That came from that agriculture, even though agriculture is a really small part of their business model. It was the kind of the originator of that. And then interestingly, the largest part of the agriculture department is the Forest Service. Kansas is not known for its national forests. And so I became an antagonist of Senators Murkowski and Stevens, who were the two, at the time, the two senators. Didi, you remember these people, how easy they were to deal with, probably. And so you know, the Clinton-Gordon administration was involved in a lot of steep environmental policy involving forests, and so I was, of course, worked for Gordon Clinton, and I was not going to follow down that road. But that allowed me to have a lot of access into other areas beyond just traditional production agriculture. I'm taking this a little far afield, but what it did do is it allowed me to, and then I found that food was a subject that brought everybody together. It didn't matter what your philosophy you were. And so all these issues involving nutrition, GMOs, organic foods, you know, these became hot items. And you know, there's later on in the book where I talk about I was the most assaulted member of the cabinet. Yeah. And it was all about food. So that was a niche. That's a great niche. And what you have to do in Congress is carve out a niche that's a little different. And then these were issues, by and large, that were very bipartisan. I mean, my closest allies were Bob Dole and the other, he became the senator, Pat Roberts, they were Republican congressman. And Dole and I used to fight a lot politically, but would always work together on agriculture policy. There was never even a thought of not doing that.
Is there something, at the risk of wonking out a little bit though, is there something you talk in the book, and you just reiterate it now, that the Ag Committee in Congress is the most bipartisan committee in Congress? And you're suggesting some of it is because it's, you know, responsible for giving away money. But what are there any other structural features of that committee or elements of that committee that led to bipartisanship that could be imported or translated or extended to other committee structures in Congress to foster bipartisanship?
That's a good question. So the Agriculture Committee had the jurisdiction over food programs, hunger, poor people, and had jurisdiction over farmers, rural America, and by and large people had a different set of views and values. And you had to build a coalition there, an urban-rural coalition. Kept both of those programs alive. We spent $70 billion this past year on food stamps, SNAP, and probably almost an equal amount on farm programs. And that was because of that coalition, that if you didn't have it in that committee, you wouldn't have been able to get people together on. So that's one pretty good example. And that even lasts till today, although it's not as bipartisan as it once was. It's one of the more bipartisan committees. Now, I would say something else. It was it was an entirely white committee. There's not a lot of diversity in rural America. There is, but there wasn't a lot of racial diversity in rural America. There's income diversity. So later on, when I had to deal with the issue of discrimination against black farmers when I was at the Department of Agriculture, and I look back at my 18 years in Congress, we did not have one hearing over 18 years over the issue of black farmer discrimination. Why? Because there weren't any blacks on the committee. And it's a different story today.
We'll jump around a little bit because we're moving sequentially. Obviously, you did 18 years in the 4th Congressional District in Kansas. Then, as Bert suggested, I guess it was in 1994 that you lost the election. We'll come back to that. And then, as your beloved son has said, you failed upward and got a cabinet position. And then went on after that to run the MPAA. But while we're in the ag discussion for a space, let's go to the USDA time. You talked about how there were there were no discussions of racial discrimination historically in ag programs with black farmers. And then there was this important case, I guess it's Pigford versus Glickman. And could you talk a little bit about that case that brought up this issue of discrimination against black farmers? And then maybe comment, Dan, if you would, is there anything about that case and how you and your successors at the USDA have handled it that's instructive or relevant about the current conversations more broadly having to do with slavery and reparations?
I think there's a lot to do with it. In 1900, there were 1 million black farmers in America. Today, there are, I think, maybe 30,000. I don't know what the numbers are. And a lot of this is just the consolidation in agriculture. The big got bigger, the small got bought out, and it's tough being a small farmer of any racial background. But USDA, Franklin Roosevelt was a great president, but when during the Depression, poverty was really endemic in rural America. So he created a system where locally elected farmers would run the programs. And in the South, many of those locally elected farmers, after they went home at night, went out and wore white sheets. And blacks were treated in many, if not most cases, disproportionately and discriminated in terms of the operation of farm programs. So as a result of that, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of blacks moved north to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Chicago, where they could find jobs. So, in some sense, you can trace the urban America and a lot of the issues to what happened where African American farmers were no longer either welcome or could make a living in that part of the world. So that's become a big issue. And the day I got to the Department of Agriculture, I was nominated and sworn in, I remember, March 30th, 1995. I went to the department, and I knew a little bit about this issue because I had been briefed. And I go there, and there is a demonstration of about 200 African American farmers right as I walk in, and they were carrying signs. And it wasn't really directed at me. It was directed at the cause. And, I looked at my chief of staff. His name is Greg Frazier, and I won't tell you exactly what I said, but I said, "Oh," and then a word begins with S and ends with T. And I said, "What's this all about?" And he says, "Well, we're gonna have a challenge in this department." And so we did it. I worked on this issue for years, and I could understand how African Americans felt. And I didn't know if all their allegations were accurate or not, but I knew that they felt dramatically mistreated over the years in terms of farm loans and not being eligible for them and not being able to expand and a variety of different things. And then they wanted to meet with Clinton, and I remember this, so I said, okay. And Clinton's from Arkansas. Clinton was, as Dee Dee knows, and Todd and others, Clinton was the proverbial good old boy. He loved the Department of Agriculture. I mean, he knew every program. He called me once and he said, "You got to get that cotton loan rate up." And I'm thinking to myself, what other president would call anybody? Could Donald Trump even know what a cotton loan rate was? I barely knew what a cotton loan rate was. And so I brought a lot of these farmers up, and we had this meeting with him, and he sat there and he listened. He was a pretty good listener. He didn't talk. He listened, and then one after the other, and I wasn't the target of all this, but after it was over, he said, "Solve this problem. you take care of it. He didn't really say keep me out of it, but he kind of was implied that you take care of it. And I didn't totally solve the problem. We partially solved the problem. And this case still carries my name even till today. We paid $1.2 billion out in a big settlement to farmers. And then the current secretary, Tom Vilsack, has also continued this effort. And it's just been a perennial problem. The Department of Agriculture, Lincoln had, it was created by Lincoln as a way to give seeds to farmers all over the country. And it later became known as the last plantation. And so I didn't want to leave it worse than I got to it. So I did a pretty good job, not perfect. And then during the Bush administration, it kind of slid sideways. But and under Obama and now under Biden, the secretary has become much more aggressive and active in this. And what it taught me is that this issue of systemic racism, I saw it firsthand, And again, not every case and every claim was accurate, but overall it was accurate. So,
do you think there's a framework there that's relevant that could be used for?
Well, first place is that the chairman of the Agriculture Committee is African American now in the House. His name is David Scott from Georgia. There are African Americans on the committee. So it's a different world, and so I don't know if it's a framework or not, but because interestingly on public policy, whether you're African American or not, you tend to support anything farmers want, no matter what it does to the deficit. To be honest with you, we've spent about $55 billion in the last 3 years on programs for farmers, because of COVID and China and everything else. And so people will work together if they have a common purpose. And there's certainly in recent years been that common purpose.
Good, thank you. Let's segue to adversity for a second. You invoke the motto of your home state on multiple occasions, ad astra per aspera, something like that, Latin phrase, I guess, to the stars through difficulty, something like that. So, by the way, much better motto than California.
What's California?
Eureka.
I mean, but you will have to admit, when they got here and they saw the mountains and the ocean, it was Eureka. They wouldn't say that going through the plains of Kansas.
I think I might have referred to gold. But anyway, a lot more content in Kansas's version. So, but could you talk a little bit about your own professional, and if you'd be open enough in this kind of warm and receptive group, in your to some adversities in your professional personal life, where you talked and you were very open in the book, December 1999, losing both of your parents in a short period of time. But what's a professional moment in your life, and maybe another personal moment in your life where this motto really rang true for you?
Well, I mean, so again, I lost my parents within about 10 days of each other, and thank God, neither of them suffered at all. They just died. So it's not a bad way to lose your parents. I mean, everybody has to go some way, and at least my brother and sister used to say, well, they did it respectfully for us at least. But, I don't know. I think the most personal adversity I had was something involving the house bank. You all remember that? The house had a bank. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't like Citibank or whatever. It was a cooperative. And you would deposit your paychecks in this cooperative. It had been in existence, I think, since Andrew Jackson's time. And then what happened was, if you were short 1 month, they'd take money out of Todd's account because he was always responsible. And then at the end of the month, then they would reconcile these balances. And so when Newt Gingrich started flexing his muscles, they did a House investigation of the House Bank. And they found that most members of Congress, if you looked at classic accounting, had overdrafts every month. And And so anyway, then all of a sudden this became a big scandal, and I remember I had 105 overdrafts over a 27-month period. But they were all paid. They weren't bounced checks. But this to the public became bounced checks. And CNN it's hard to believe how irritating a television network can be. But CNN ran over and over a roll ad with every member of Congress who had overdrafts and how many that they had. So I remember this was really tough on me because reputationally, it's like people thought I was a deadbeat. And the only thing that kind of saved me was two things. I'll talk about what Rhoda did, but my dad wasn't poor. So they knew that I didn't do this because I needed the money. I was just sloppy. And and I thought, and then I remember going in these parades and the signs, hey Glickman, how many checks did you bounce today? And these signs were up and down the street. And I mean, this was really tough because reputation, this looked like, I'm never going to get over it. And so...
Rubbergate.
It's Rubbergate because, so anyway, it's long since memories. Donald Trump's, it's interesting, all the stuff we've been through in the last 4 years, this stuff pales in consideration. But I have learned one thing. Everybody understood this problem. There wasn't anybody who didn't understand what a check was and what a bounced check was. Even though this didn't bounce. I kept saying, it's not bounced, it's paid. The best checks in the world were the checks in the house bank because Todd Purdom had all the money in the world. I could take it out of his account. And, or Dee Dee. I don't know who has the money in your family, but whatever. So anyway, Rhoda, I went to you have a gridiron club here. I mean, the members of the media, they have a big gridiron. This is all over the country. They have the big gridiron dinners. In Washington, you've seen these gridiron dinners. Remember, Nancy Reagan did one, and she sang Secondhand Rose and made fun of her clothes. And George W. Bush had his clone there one night. And Clinton and Clinton's, they had a movie of him going through the Lincoln bedroom and where people were sleeping. And so we had this Wichita Gridiron Club, and there were thousands of people who came in. Rhoda helped write a song to Sweet Charity's Hey Big Spender. Okay. And I used to think that I had a great voice, and so I came out and we did this parody of Hey Big Spender, and I remember one line, just send me back one more time. I'll give him hell, give him flack. I can't remember what the, send me back one more time. Give me one more look. I'll give him flack, and I'm not a crook. And then one line I didn't know how to add or subtract. And I'm telling you, overnight that changed and then people came up to me and said, I bounced checks. It's really not such a terrible thing. And I did this, and then other things, and it also taught me a lesson that if you show some humility and sometimes you're an idiot, it can really make a difference. So learning to laugh at yourself. You're learning to laugh at yourself. And that really that episode was probably the most difficult time I had. I mean, I sought professional help, and it was like went through this massive depression. And it was largely because I people thought that I had lost my way, and I didn't know the right thing to do. And to their credit, my parents and Rhoda were totally supportive. And my dad said, it's no big deal. Just think, if I hadn't put $35,000 in your account, you would have been overdrafting 300 checks. And we had this news conference, and some of the members blamed their spouses. I knew that wouldn't work with her. First of all, it wasn't true, and second of all, I wouldn't have a place to go home and sleep.
You talk, Dan, about and reference it a number of ways in the book, that the two most important qualities in a great leader, I'm paraphrasing, but basically listening and learning from other points of view, and then if you disagree, don't do so disagreeably. Where did you develop that sort of perspective on leadership?
Well, first of all, I've always been impressed with good listeners. And You know, I think it was my mother used to say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. You listen twice as much as you talk. And Bob Dole also. It's interesting, my relationship with Dole. I don't know how many of you, I mean, Dole is 97 years old. He has 1 kidney, 1 this, 1 of that, 1 of everything. He's got brain cancer. And I talked to him last month, and he says, isn't it strange that me and Jimmy Carter have the same disease and we're still going strong? You know, it just, Carter, who Dole called Southern Fried McGovern when he ran for president. Some of you may not remember any of these names. But anyway, so I learned, not that I couldn't open my mouth, but I learned that you just were better off not talking if you didn't know what you were talking about. And especially in the Congress, that's not a trait that most people have. So that was certainly the one thing. The other thing was not burning bridges. So that helped me all through life, that I didn't have any enemies. So every step I took, like when I became secretary, it was the Republicans came to my defense as much as the Democrats. And when I got to the MPAA, and Valenti chose me, basically. He wanted me in that job for a lot of different reasons. And I got lots of Republicans to support me, in addition to President Clinton and others as well. But that's because I did my best not to make enemies. And I just, and I found that humor would often make the difference. At the right moment, I could say something funny or light, and people would relax. And you look at your great leaders. Okay, so you look back at Lincoln, FDR. Yeah, I'd say Lincoln, FDR, Kennedy, and Reagan were impactful because of this great sense of humor. And you know, a lot of it was staged. I remember Groucho Marx had this great line: "The most important quality in politics is sincerity. And when you can fake that, you got it made." You know, and you know, it's true. You don't have to totally fake it. He also had this other great line: "These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I got others." You know, and so you know, it's like, but I think that you know, that kind of attitude helped me. You know, so even when I lost, you know, I was in upper consideration for other jobs, and I found this even afterwards. I'd spent 10 years at the Aspen Institute, doing my best to get bipartisan delegations of Congress to work together, and sometimes it worked, sometimes didn't work. And you know, once in a while, people thought maybe I should have taken stronger positions on issues than I did. And look, in '94, when I lost my election for really 3 reasons, and in a sense, I'm kind of proud of it. One, I voted for firearms legislation, the Brady bill, and the assault weapons ban. About 60 Democrats lost their seats that year because of that vote. And then the choice issue, because Wichita was the center of the Summer of Mercy in the United States. We had the largest demonstrations in America on abortion. And in fact, you may recall we had a doctor, Dr. Tiller, who was killed in a church in Wichita by an anti-abortion activist. So those 2 issues, plus Clinton health care bill, probably did me in. But I don't regret any of that stuff, because the other thing I learned from that stream of consciousness now is that, as John sometimes says, failing upwards. But I learned that being the congressman wasn't the most important. There are other things that happen. Good things happen. And what's happened today is that I think in the Congress is that too many of them think this job is so important. And some of them actually, this is the best job they've ever had. And they're actually, even at $180,000 a year, they made more money in this job than they've ever made in their life. And so they don't want to take any risks to lose the job. And just this whole thing with the insurrection, or the vote on the commission, or the vote on the electoral college. You know, we have a political environment. It's more on the right than it is on the left, although it's on both sides. It's to some degree, but the people on the right do not want to challenge their base. because their base is these are gerrymandered districts, and they don't want to take on their base, because if they do, they will lose. They'll lose. And so, but my point to them is, okay, so you lose. So you can find something better. There are better things out there than being in elected office. But it's hard to think about that when you're in the middle of things.
You know, we want to make sure that there's some time. Bert didn't impose a time limit,
Yeah.
but we know that it's a Monday night. And, so I want to make sure that there's some time for folks to ask questions. I mean, this is looking at the sophistication level of this group. I suspect there's going to be some great questions for you, but one or two more before we get to sort of a Q&A, Dan. Just your political radar for a second. So you talk about the importance of authenticity in a politician. If you could identify for us the most promising, authentic politician in America today that none of us have heard of, who do you think is an extraordinary, authentic leader that really has not splashed across the headlines of the American media yet, or the American political consciousness that we ought to have on our radar? Anyone?
Well, I don't know if I can identify any one person. I do think we have geriatric leadership in America, and I think we're beginning to look like the Politburo, the old Soviet Politburo. Remember those guys up there? They all were dead. They were embalmed, and they were looking at the marchers and the tanks marching on. And and frankly, the Republicans have done a better job at getting younger people into the political system than the Democrats have, because it's just the way it works. But there are a lot of younger members of Congress, many of them who are veterans or have been in the intelligence community. There's one guy, Chris Coons. He's a senator from Delaware. Outstanding human being. There's this guy, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, Republican, also very good. He's independent, sensible, and there are a fair number of younger members who are in their late 30s, early 40s who've come in for a time period. But I can't really give you who is the next genius, FDR, Roosevelt, Kennedy, or anybody like that. I'm not familiar with enough to do that.
Okay. Bert, can we open it up for some...
Yes, the first question.
Okay, yeah.
So, first of all, thank you guys for doing this. Daniel and the Danny show is fantastic. I wondered, seeing what's happened to American politics and what it means now to be in elected office and seek elected office, were you 35 today, would you consider running for Congress?
Yeah, I still think it's the greatest job in the world. You have more ability to influence your surroundings, and especially individual people, than almost any other job. You know, so I was able to do a lot of things to help people that didn't get a lot of huge attention. For example, I did early on, I did some big things, like I'm from Wichita. Half the airplanes in the world are built in Wichita, Kansas. Did anybody know that here? Okay, home of Beech, Corey knows, home of Cessna, home of Learjet. Boeing, until recently, built all their commercial airplanes, the fuselage in Wichita. When I came to Congress, there were 70,000 aircraft workers in a town of 180,000 people in Wichita. This would be like Detroit having 700,000 auto workers. So I did some stuff that helped the small airplane industry. It saved them and involved product liability protection. Every time a small plane went down, you know, the judgments were 10 million, 15 million. So I got the law changed, which said if the airplane was over a certain age and you couldn't prove gross negligence, then you couldn't hold the manufacturer liable. I fought the trial lawyers on that. I was the only Democrat that took on the trial lawyers, and I ultimately passed that bill. They really didn't take courage because it was the right thing to do, and I felt that very strongly. I was also working for, you know, my constituents, you know, in that process. But going back to your other question is yeah, I think that I would. You know, I just think you have more ability to do things, and the challenges are greater than when I served. I'll tell you, they're just the outside influences, money in politics. I ran for Congress in '76 and spent $97,000 defeating an incumbent Republican congressman. He spent $100,000. Today, it would be, that race would be, you'd spend about $97,000 a day. It would be a $5 million race. So I was able to go door to door. Rhoda and I walked 35 to 40,000 houses, doors. She walked one side of the street, I walked the other side of the street. I weighed 132 pounds at the time, and had dark hair, and we learned how to get along with dogs. That's why I think one of our dogs is here, at least was here, and couldn't do that today at all. So the problem with, the ultimate answer to your question is you got to go through so much more, as the Jewish word is soros, to get into Congress. You got to have money all the time, spending money. You got to deal with a different set of media that you ever did before. Local newspapers were big. My hometown paper, the Wichita Eagle, had the highest penetration rate of any newspaper in the United States. More people in that town read that paper than comparable of anywhere. Today it looks like the insert of the USA Today, maybe, on a good day. And that's, of course, true with newspapers all over the country. So I could rely on newspaper coverage and relationship with newspapers and the local TV stations, and now those don't mean anything to people. So it's just a lot tougher than it used to be.
So I have two questions that are somewhat unrelated to one another. The first is, as a Jew in Kansas growing up, did you ever experience discrimination? And the second has to do with the issue of guns. You described how your position on guns had an impact on your race and may have led to your losing. In a country that's increasingly arming itself with a mass shooting every day, what kind of advice would you give on how we can bring people together to change the direction in which we're heading and establish reasonable gun laws?
Okay, so let me take the easy question first. The Jew in Kansas. Okay, so because there were only like 200 Jewish families in Wichita, they didn't know what it was. Anyway, you know, a sect of the Baptist church, kind of. But I found it to be a real asset to me. Now, I had some people often say, you know, I think you're going to hell, but you're a pretty good congressman, so I'm going to vote for you anyway. I mean, variations on that theme would happen, but I tell you two quick stories. So Clinton used to make a thing, he thought it was great. He said, imagine I'm the president who appointed the first Jewish Secretary of Agriculture in history, and his main job is promoting the pork industry. And he got such a kick out of that. And so I was out in West Texas one time, and near Lubbock, and I learned from my dad schmoozing. You know, you can talk to people about anything. And so a lot of times farmers would look down when you talk to them, and I'd try to make them feel comfortable and to get them to look me in the eye. So they hadn't had rain for 6 months. It was dry as a bone. And I like the weather. It's one of my hobbies is to look at the weather. And so, I still today, I look at the Weather Channel like I did tonight. I looked in Washington to see the radar. They had big thunderstorms in Washington tonight. And so it rained that night. And I had a feeling it was going to rain. And so the next day we were in a Best Western, and the lady came up to me. She was on the county commission there, and she says, well, Mr. Glickman, and my name had 5 syllables, the way she said it. She said, we didn't know much about you, but now we know why you're the chosen people. Okay. So you know, and then there was a thing called posse comitatus back in the late 1970s, right-wing conspiracy, kind of like the Proud Boys, but they were more exclusively about agriculture, and they liked me, and they liked Bob Dole, but they didn't like Jews. And so one of the TV stations in Wichita interviewed one of these guys and said, well, who do you, he said, well, Dole and Glickman are doing a good job. And one of them said, well, did you know that Glickman's a Jew? And so the guy thought for a moment, he says, yeah, but he's not a Zionist. And, you know, and so I guess I reached that threshold where I made it okay. So it wasn't, I mean, look, there were always kind of undercurrents a little bit, but I found that if you did your job right, you know, you could handle it all right. And a lot of that came from my parents who, taught me how to respect everybody, and you could get along with people, and you find something to talk to them about. And I also learned as going door to door that I'd size up people's houses, their cars, their bumper stickers. I'd look for anything I could about a person's house, so that when I go knock on their door, I'd say, "Oh, I see you have X," or "I see you fish at Lake Winnebago," and whatever. And that's good politician. So that I learned some of those skills. On the gun thing, this is as much a cultural issue as it is a crime issue, and it wasn't as big of an issue back there. NRA was a force, but I'm convinced it's not the NRA. It's the intensity that people have about their ownership. So let me tell you this quick story. Going door to door, I just passed this bill on airplanes. It saved thousands of jobs. My piece of legislation, Bert, I'll tell you about it if you want to know about product liability on small airplane manufacturers. So I go door to door at this house, and this man comes in. "Oh, Mr. Glickman, yeah, I've seen your dad at the ball games, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah." And so I said to him, "Well, I sure would like your vote." And he says, "We sure think you did a good job on that aviation bill. Can't vote for you, though." And I never forget this, and I said, "Why?" He said, "Mr. Glickman, you just don't understand." He says, "You have a very nice family. You have great cars. You're wealthy. You can go wherever you want. You own the baseball team. You just have it all." And he says, "All I have is my job, working job." He worked in an airplane as a machinist, maybe made at that time $6, $7 an hour. And he says, "All I have is my hunting and my gun." And he said, "This is part of my life, and you want to take it away from me." Now, I sat there and I first tried to argue with him a little bit and say, "Well, I'm not trying to take it away, and you don't need an AK-47, and and then I'm thinking to myself, this ain't going very well. And so when that last election I lost, I won all the Republican precincts, or most of them, and I lost heavily in the blue-collar Democratic precincts, the people who worked in the airplane factories, the people who were hunters. And so it taught me, boy, this is a real problem, because they're wrong in the sense that they don't need the massive gun, repetitive, guns that kill spray bullets and kill people, everything else. And then they have been manipulated by politicians in other areas who tie this to the revolution's coming, you need to be at home to protect yourself and everything else. But I saw this, it doesn't help explaining it this way, because we need reasonable gun legislation, without question. But I saw this as this deep cultural issue in the heartland. And I don't know, Corey, whether you saw it the same way or not, but that's the reason, one of the reasons why. And remember when Barack Obama said they cling to their guns and their religion. And there are a lot of people who said, "Oh, these people are fools and they're stupid," and but it's the way they feel, and it's deep, and it's just I don't we got to do the best we can under those circumstances. That's all I can say, and it's I think there have been some changes. Some moderate Republicans have moved on these issues, but if you look at the heartland of America now, it's all red. And when I was growing up, it was more purple. It's just all red. So, and these are small states with 2 senators. Every one of them has 2 votes. Yeah. Corey, back there.
Okay.
She is from Kansas, and
I have to bear witness a little bit because I grew up with you as my congressman. And I was from a red household, because as conservative as you get, John Birch Society.
Wow.
And they liked you. They genuinely liked you. And I'd ask my dad, "So why do you like that guy?" And well, he takes care of Kansas. He's our guy. He's not a bad guy. He's our guy. And you did a really amazing thing of, just like your stories are saying, you took care of your constituents.
don't you let her in today.
But you also, you know, you always impressed me in that, I mean, I knew the country club wouldn't let you be a member.
Yeah, the country clubs were restricted back then.
Oh, yeah.
They're no longer restricted because they need the dues.
Yeah.
But
But you know, you just didn't care, and it was really sweet, and it was and I have to say, as somebody who's watched Kansas circle the drain, you remind me that of being very proud of you, because you were that. But my question is,
uh-oh.
how did you see the Kochs? How did you see Charlie and David, and how did they interact with you, and what were they like when you were the congressman representing them?
Okay, so folks know the other big industry headquartered in Wichita is one Koch Industries. And so all of the nefarious things you hear about the Kochs started in Wichita, Kansas, because their father, Fred Koch, was a petroleum engineer who developed the cracking process to convert crude oil into gasoline. And he made a lot of money, and then the Russians stiffed him during the 20s and 30s, and he became a virulent anti-communist. And they have formed, I think, the largest private corporation in America, or certainly close to that. And so their children, who I don't know all that well, there are 4 brothers, and Charles is the dominant figure in Wichita. I really didn't know them that well, and they never really bothered me. I mean, when they had an issue, an economic issue, I would deal with it sometimes, until I voted for the Clinton energy bill. Pardon?
The we got
BTU.
BTU.
It created a British thermal unit tax, a BTU tax that would have impacted them. And then they turned on me on a dime. It wasn't because of guns, it wasn't because of abortion, it was because of pure economics and what it would do to the energy industry. And then they turned on me big time, and you know, I've often thought back, should I have courted them more early? I really didn't know them. They did their own thing, and but they took me on rather significantly in my '94 race, and that's about the best I could tell you. They had their own. They hadn't started a lot of their own stuff, where creating the political finance stuff that they have now. Did you know them at all? I knew Charles's wife, Liz, a little bit.
I did not know them, but Charlie was a member of my parents' John Birch Society cell.
Yeah.
So he was a god in our house.
Yeah, the Birch Society was founded by a guy named Robert Welch from Boston, but its strongest support was in Wichita. So, but it was a little bit while I was still in junior high and high school, and then it kind of faded a bit after I left and ran for office. But
Yeah.
they never supported me, that I can tell you. Yeah.
Well, I don't remember them having a political organization of any kind, and then suddenly they became this huge force in our country.
Yeah.
That I don't remember them that way at all as a kid.
Yeah, I did not know them very well, so I can't comment. Interestingly, Charles's best friend was a Jewish fellow in Wichita named Leslie Rudd.
Yeah.
And I've Les owned Rudd Wineries. It's up in Sonoma, and what's the rest? What's the Dina DeLuca, and they were very, very close friends.
Any one last question, then we'll let people, there are a lot of old friends here, I know, we'll let people hang out and talk more informally, but any last question for Papa Danny, AKA Secretary Glickman? Todd.
Daniel, first, thanks for a great job, and Mr. Secretary, so glad to have you here. You referenced the Trump administration and the unpredictability of life for those 4 years, and I think we can all kind of stipulate that the Republican Party has its problems now. But what subscribe to the notion that the left's emphasis on phrases like defund the police and all of this kind of political ferment on the left, what James Carville calls faculty lounge politics, is that hurting the National Democrats? I mean, you come, as President Eisenhower said, from the heart of America, so I assume that's problematic.
Well, when I started hearing the term defund the police, I thought to myself, uh-oh, this is not very good language to talk about, because they did polling and they found that among various ethnic groups, the Hispanic community had the strongest negative reaction to this language, because it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of bad cops around, but you need the cops to protect society. You just need good cops rather than bad cops. So I think that's certainly a factor. But I tell you what, the potential of high inflation worries me, because remember what happened to Gerald Ford with the very high inflation, and that elected Jimmy Carter, and I think that's actually a more serious challenge to the demographics and the elections that are coming up. If we see inflation go up above 5%, Democrats have problems. But it's certainly a complicated question, and my hope is, and then I also worry about the deficit. Nobody worries about the deficit anymore. My God, we have a $6 trillion deficit. When Trump came in, it was $3 trillion, but it's been growing arithmetically. Maybe it's fine. Maybe the global world is such that we don't even need to worry about this anymore. You would know more about this than I would.
I think we need to worry about it.
But on the other hand, that's not a great issue for Democrats to be pushing for. I'll close with one thing. So I talked to Bob Dole about 4 weeks ago, and as I said, he's not well. And I said, well, what do you think of the Republican Party? And he just said, we need leadership. And I really do think that the country is crying out for what I call thoughtful, sensible leadership that can help guide us through these things. But it's tough because you've got to have a populace that's willing to go along. Pogo said we have met the enemy and he is us, and us are the people. So, I hope Biden has the right tone. There's no question. Tonally, he's a really in a good position to try to do his best to deal with folks like McConnell and others who really don't want to cooperate with him. And that's one of the reasons why this may be heresy in this room. So I'll say it anyway because I'm not running for office anymore. I don't look at Joe Manchin as the enemy of the people at all. I mean, I disagree with him on his opposition to a lot of the provisions in H.R. 1 or the Voting Rights Act. But when you have a 50-50 Congress, you need some people who aren't afraid to step out a bit and try to get folks together. And he at least is making that effort. And I don't see very many other people making that effort on either side of the aisle right now.
So maybe, thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Maybe in conclusion, I'll just invoke a reference that you make early on in the book. I think quoting the Bible, actually saying that a person's good name is more precious than all the gold in the world. And I would just submit that for those of us who know you well, that in your 76 years or so on this planet, you've created a lot of precious value. And I suspect that for your grandchildren, Cal and May and Leo and Lucy, it may very well be the most valuable thing that you bequeath to them. So just want to say in conclusion, thank you for being here and for sharing some of your life with us. It's been a great pleasure, and hopefully we can all mingle a bit and spend some more time together before
let me just say,
Chevalier picks it up.
I want to thank Bert and reinforce the need to keep this bookstore vibrant. And just to say that the books will be here tomorrow or the next day. I promise you that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.